At 6:47 a.m., on April 3, 1943, the bridge crew of a Japanese destroyer spotted a strange disturbance cutting through the gray Pacific swells. At first it looked like nothing, just a shimmer where the morning haze met the sea. Then the shimmer thickened. The water split. Steel rose through the surface in a burst of white spray. A submarine was surfacing, and not off their flank or behind their screen, but directly in front of their bow, barely 900 yards away. For a full second, no one moved. The helmsman gripped the wheel, waiting for the captain to shout something, anything. The destroyer was already charging ahead at flank speed, throwing a rolling wall of water high over the bow. The submarine's conning tower punched through that wall like a blade. One lookout gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Suicidal," he muttered. "The Americans have truly lost their minds." Below them, the sub's deck lurched as it forced its way to the surface. 3 crewmen clung to the railings, bracing themselves as seawater hammered over the bow. The destroyer's forward guns slewed toward the target, barrels dipping, struggling to acquire a firing angle in the violent spray. The first officer leaned forward, squinting. "That boat shouldn't be here," he said. "No submarine surfaces in front of a destroyer." He didn't realize it yet, but he was witnessing the signature maneuver of the most unpredictable submarine in the entire Pacific theater. A boat whose captain had discovered a quirk in Japanese sonar, a narrow funnel of confusion, directly beneath a charging destroyer's prow. A place no doctrine mentioned, a place no destroyer trained to defend. Sometimes the safest place was the place the enemy assumed was impossible. Spray hammered the bridge windows. The destroyer's bow lifted and plunged as it tore through the swell. Distances collapsed. 800 yards. 600. 400. The captain snapped orders helm over, prepare depth charges, ready the starboard guns, but the submarine kept advancing, riding the surface with defiant purpose, as if daring the destroyer to come closer. And then, in the chaos of foam and steel, someone on the bridge whispered what everyone else had begun to feel. "This isn't a mistake. They're charging us. You're 17 standarded." The destroyer surged forward through the cold April swells as the morning fog thinned into long streaks of pale light drifting across the Pacific, revealing just enough detail for the Japanese officers to sense how badly the situation could turn if they hesitated even for a moment. Although the submarine ahead looked reckless and exposed on the surface, every man on that bridge understood that any miscalculation at this range could flip the advantage instantly, especially in waters where engagements were measured in seconds rather than minutes. The sea reflected a dull silver under the rising sun, and the destroyer's bow sliced through it with a rhythmic pound that sent deep vibrations up through the steel deck and into the souls of every sailor bracing for impact. Beyond the immediate confrontation, the surrounding waters represented one of Japan's most carefully monitored transit corridors, patrolled by multiple destroyers equipped with aggressive anti-submarine tactics refined through months of brutal engagements against American boats. Intelligence reports claim that U.S. submarines rarely ventured this far into the lane without running silently at depth, and certainly never attempted to challenge a screening group head-on, which only intensified the officers' confusion as they watched the American vessel refuse to dive or retreat. The destroyer squadron operating in the region was considered among the most proficient in the Imperial Navy, fielding well-trained sonar teams, quick-firing guns, and depth charge patterns designed to tear any submerged target apart before it could escape. Even now, 2 additional destroyers were sweeping the outskirts of the area, forming a tightening arc that, under normal circumstances, would trap a submerged submarine against the ocean floor with no realistic avenue of escape. A network of sonar pings echoed through the water, overlapping in steady pulses that created an invisible cage around anything moving beneath the surface, and the Japanese officers had absolute faith that this system made them nearly untouchable against traditional submarine tactics. The destroyer's radio crackled with brief updates from the other ships as they confirmed bearings, closing speeds, and depth probes, each message reinforcing their collective belief that the submarine ahead was acting irrationally, perhaps damaged or suffering from a catastrophic systems failure. The captain stepped closer to the bridge windows, watching the spray erupt around the submarine's bow as it rode the waves with alarming stability for a vessel that should have been desperately trying to submerge, and he began to sense that something about this engagement was diverging from every scenario they had rehearsed. In his experience, American submarines usually avoided any situation where destroyers could bring their speed and maneuverability to bear, choosing instead to hide in thermal layers or exploit sonar distortions along coastal shelves. But this particular boat seemed intent on eliminating every advantage the Japanese ships possessed. A faint tension settled across the bridge as the crew realized that the submarine's approach angle placed it directly beneath the destroyer's optimal sonar sweep, a blind funnel where returning signals blurred into static due to turbulence created by the bow at high speed. Despite this anomaly, the officers remained confident, convinced that raw firepower and aggressive maneuvering could end the confrontation quickly, especially since the destroyer still held overwhelming tactical leverage. The ship's forward batteries were already shifting into firing positions. Depth charge crews stood ready for deployment, and the engine room maintained full power to ensure rapid acceleration if the captain ordered a ramming course or evasive turn. Every calculation favored the destroyer, every projection reinforced their assumptions, and every fragment of doctrine told them that no submarine could survive inside the narrow killing zone forming between the converging ships. Yet, even as the Japanese officers prepared to strike, an uneasy thought crept into the back of the captain's mind. No submarine surfaced this boldly unless its commander knew something they did not, and the certainty of their advantage began to feel thinner with each yard the two vessels closed. Inside the submarine, the crew felt every vibration from the destroyer's bow wave pounding across the hull, each tremor carrying the unmistakable message that they were entering a zone no sane captain would ever choose to enter voluntarily. The control room glowed under dim red lighting, creating a tunnel-like atmosphere where every face looked tense, focused, and framed by the rhythmic flicker of gauges struggling to hold their readings against the violent motion of the sea outside. Officers leaned over consoles while enlisted men braced themselves against bulkheads, and every conversation was reduced to clipped commands that reflected a shared understanding that they were seconds from either gaining the initiative or being obliterated outright. The diving officer struggled to keep his balance as the submarine pitched upward on the swell, shouting depth estimates that changed faster than the helmsman could adjust, forcing the captain to make rapid decisions without the steady stream of data he normally relied on. A mechanic sprinted down the narrow passage toward the aft compartments, ducking under pipes and valves while shouting updates about battery drain and ballast fluctuations that confirmed what everyone already feared. The boat no longer had the power reserves to execute a traditional dive without risking a catastrophic system stall. The sonar operator pressed his headphones deeper over his ears, trying desperately to filter meaningful signals from the cacophony of turbulence created by the destroyer's bow shock, but the usual patterns he depended on had dissolved into chaotic bursts that offered no clear picture of enemy movements. Every man knew the submarine had been pushed into this surface confrontation by a sequence of mechanical failures that began the previous night, when the aft battery stack overheated during an emergency dive intended to avoid a patrol they never expected to encounter. That overheating triggered a chain reaction that drained their electrical reserves faster than predicted, forcing the engineering team to cut systems that normally kept the boat's noise profile manageable and its maneuverability stable. Without those systems, their chances of surviving underwater against trained destroyer crews dropped to nearly zero, especially in a region where Japanese anti-submarine tactics had grown increasingly aggressive and precise over months of relentless sea warfare. Complicating matters further, a ballast valve had seized partially open during their last controlled ascent, allowing seawater to enter the tanks unevenly and making it nearly impossible to maintain neutral buoyancy for more than a few minutes at a time. This defect created a subtle but constant tilt in the submarine's posture, forcing the helmsman to compensate repeatedly with small corrections that risked broadcasting their position through unexpected hull noise detectable by enemy sonar. The captain understood that all these factors, taken together, meant they could not hide below the surface or outmaneuver the destroyers in deep water, and he realized that their only viable option involved exploiting a narrow tactical window that destroyer crews never prepared for. As the destroyer closed rapidly, the captain gripped the periscope housing for stability and issued orders with a calm clarity that contrasted sharply with the growing tension throughout the compartment, creating a brief moment of steady focus as the men responded with disciplined efficiency. He outlined the strategy quickly: maintain the surface approach, hold the bow directly toward the destroyer, and prepare the forward tubes for an impossibly close firing solution that defied everything they had been taught in training. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that they were being asked to execute a maneuver that inverted every principle of submarine warfare, yet they followed the captain's commands, because they trusted his instinct more than the flawed machinery beneath their feet. The submarine groaned as another wave slammed against the hull, sending a spray of cold water across the forward deck and reminding everyone that their margin for error was shrinking with alarming speed. Still, the captain saw potential in the chaos, knowing that the disturbed water ahead of the destroyer created a sonar dead zone that could briefly mask the submarine's exact position if they held course and maintained the right angle. This strategic insight, born from dozens of combat patrols and a lifetime of understanding how steel behaved under pressure, gave the crew a sliver of hope that they might turn a desperate situation into a tactical advantage. Even as fear tightened the air inside the control room, a quiet determination settled over the men, binding them to the risky path their captain had chosen, and for the first time since the mechanical failures began, they felt that survival might still be possible if they executed the plan flawlessly. According to every submarine manual issued before the patrol, the correct response to a destroyer closing at high speed was unmistakably clear, instructing crews to dive immediately, reduce engine output, and slip into the acoustic shadows where turbulence and temperature layers could blur sonar returns. Those guidelines had been rehearsed so thoroughly in training that most crewmen could recite the sequence in their sleep, trusting that the carefully designed steps, ballast release, angle adjustment, power taper, depth hold, and silent running would keep them alive long enough to evade whatever threat happened to be hunting them. In theory, following these procedures created a predictable rhythm designed around physics and human coordination, and countless instructors had insisted that mastering this rhythm was the key to surviving against surface warships. Yet none of those procedures accounted for a submarine fighting both the ocean and its own compromised machinery, especially when a damaged ballast system and depleted batteries left the crew unable to maintain controlled depth for more than a few minutes. The manual assumed a fully functional propulsion line, responsive trim valves, and enough electrical reserve to adjust buoyancy with precision, but the men in the control room knew they currently possessed none of those conditions. Even if they attempted to submerge, the unpredictable ballast imbalance would cause sudden dips and rises that produced loud hull groans, instantly exposing their position to sonar teams trained to detect even the faintest anomalies within the layered soundscape of the Pacific. More importantly, the Doctrine failed to acknowledge a brutal truth that every veteran submarine captain eventually learned. Once a destroyer closed within a certain range, diving no longer offered safety, because the surface ship's sonar could track their movements relentlessly, while depth charges rained down in carefully patterned grids that stripped away any possibility of maneuvering. The captain had experienced this grim reality firsthand during a previous patrol, where a submerged escape almost ended with the boat being torn apart by overlapping detonations, and that memory shaped his refusal to repeat the same mistake now, especially when their weakened systems left them even less capable of enduring a prolonged underwater chase. Instead of treating the standard dive sequence as an unquestionable rule, the captain recognized it as a luxury reserved for submarines operating under ideal conditions, and he understood that clinging to those doctrines blindly would only guarantee their destruction. He also knew that destroyer commanders expected submarine crews to follow those protocols with near religious obedience, which created an exploitable vulnerability in their tactical thinking, particularly in chaotic situations where assumptions often dictated reaction speed. By refusing to dive and instead confronting the oncoming destroyer head-on, the submarine positioned itself in a way no manual ever mentioned, yet offered a fleeting tactical advantage tied entirely to human habit rather than engineering theory. Even so, the risk was undeniable, because the destroyer still held the power to ram or fire point blank if its captain reacted quickly enough, and this reality pressed down on the submarine crew like a physical weight as the vessels continued closing the distance. The engineering officer moved back and forth across the control room, checking gauges that flickered more unpredictably with each second, knowing that one misplaced surge or valve malfunction could erase the narrow window of opportunity the captain hoped to exploit. Crewmen tightened their grips on whatever supports they could find, bracing for the violent impact they feared might arrive before their bold maneuver produced the tactical misdirection required for survival. Despite these mounting pressures, a steady confidence emerged in the captain's voice as he issued orders designed to synchronize the crew's actions into a single, flowing motion, reflecting his belief that the only path forward involved embracing controlled unpredictability rather than rigid adherence to a failing doctrine. The men sensed that their survival depended on trusting this deviation from regulation, and their collective focus sharpened as they prepared to rewrite the next seconds of the engagement through sheer determination and precise execution. In that tense moment, the boundaries between fear and resolve blurred, and the crew understood that the difference between annihilation and advantage would be decided by their ability to challenge the very procedures meant to protect them. The captain had long suspected that Japanese destroyer crews, despite their discipline and impressive training, placed enormous trust in the precision of their sonar systems. Assuming those instruments could read the ocean like a map and identify every submerged threat with mechanical certainty. That assumption worked flawlessly against submarines, following predictable patterns, boats that tried to dive, angle away, or hide beneath thermal layers, where sonar operators practiced detecting subtle distortions created by temperature shifts. However, the captain's experience in earlier engagements convinced him that sonar performance deteriorated drastically when confronted with chaotic turbulence created by a destroyer's bow at high speed, generating a wedge of acoustic confusion directly ahead of the ship that operators rarely acknowledged. He had noticed this quirk months earlier during a patrol near the Solomon Islands, where a destroyer raced past his boat so quickly that its sonar returns scattered into a cloud of meaningless echoes that momentarily blinded the operator, allowing the submarine to slip away before charges could be deployed. That fleeting moment, once dismissed as an anomaly, returned to him repeatedly during subsequent encounters, gradually crystallizing into a theory that the ocean itself could become a shield if approached from the right angle and at the right moment. While no manual mentioned this phenomenon, and no official doctrine recognized its strategic value, the captain understood that real war often revealed unexpected gaps in engineered systems, especially when those systems were pushed beyond the conditions their designers originally tested. Inside the submarine, he explained this insight to his officers with calm authority, outlining how the oncoming destroyer's bow wave created a churning plume so violent that sonar pulses fractured into fragments, incapable of producing coherent range data. The closer they aligned themselves with the destroyer's forward axis, the more aggressively that turbulence masked their true position, effectively turning the area immediately in front of the ship into a blind corridor where traditional detection tools became almost useless. His officers listened with a mixture of apprehension and fascination, realizing that this maneuver, though dangerously counterintuitive, might neutralize the destroyer's principal advantage if executed with perfect timing and unwavering composure. The captain emphasized that their damaged machinery, rather than being solely a liability, inadvertently pushed them into adopting a tactic that fully functioning boats would never attempt, creating a paradox where weakness became the catalyst for an unexpected strategic edge. Because their ballast system could not sustain a controlled dive and their batteries lacked the charge necessary for extended silent running, the submarine was forced to remain on the surface longer than Doctrine allowed, placing them at precisely the angle needed to exploit the destroyer's acoustic vulnerability. What seemed suicidal to the enemy, and even to some of his own crew, was in fact a calculated decision, rooted in a deeper understanding of how water, sound, and motion interacted under pressure. Meanwhile, aboard the destroyer, sonar operators struggled with the sudden distortion filling their screens, unable to reconcile the chaotic noise with the expectation that a submarine should either dive or break contact when confronted head-on. Their training relied on identifying targets moving within predictable pathways, yet the American submarine's direct approach produced a signature that looked less like a traditional contact and more like scattered interference caused by wave action, leading several operators to assume the submarine was beginning to dive out of sight. This misinterpretation fed into a chain of confirmation bias across the bridge, causing officers to momentarily relax their firing sequence while they attempted to re-establish a clearer track. The captain of the submarine sensed this hesitation through experience rather than instruments, recognizing the tiny window of misjudgment as the opportunity he needed to reposition the boat for a firing angle that defied every standard rule of naval engagement. He ordered the helmsman to maintain the surface heading and prepare for a rapid correction at the final approach, trusting that the destroyer's confusion would delay any decisive counteraction long enough for their torpedoes to lock onto the vulnerable forward quarter. Though every man aboard understood the stakes and the terrifying proximity of disaster, a growing resolve steadied their movements as they realized the enemy's greatest strength had, for a brief moment, transformed into a fatal blind spot. In that charged silence, as the two vessels closed the remaining distance, the crew finally grasped the full depth of their captain's insight. Recognizing that surviving this encounter would require more than courage, it demanded absolute faith in a maneuver no manual had ever dared to describe. The final stretch between the destroyer and the submarine tightened with unnerving speed, creating a sense of compressed time where every second felt impossibly dense, and every movement carried the weight of irreversible consequences. The submarine's bow rose and fell with the swells, carving unpredictable arcs through the churning water as the crew braced themselves against the violent motion that rattled pipes and sent loose tools sliding across the deck with a metallic clatter. Each passing wave pushed the submarine onto a slightly different trajectory, forcing the helmsman to fight constantly against the elements, while the captain monitored the destroyer's approach through short, steady glances that betrayed none of the tension building across the control room. On the destroyer's bridge, officers shouted overlapping commands as they attempted to re-establish a clean sonar return, struggling to understand why the submarine remained on the surface despite the imminent danger of collision. Their confusion deepened when the radar plot suggested erratic movements that contradicted the expected dive profile of a fleeing adversary, compelling the captain to rely on visual judgment rather than instruments, a decision that introduced yet another layer of uncertainty into an already chaotic engagement. The ship's bow continued to drive forward relentlessly, carving a sharp V-shaped wake that exploded into towering sheets of spray, illuminated by the morning sun, making it increasingly difficult for lookouts to maintain visual contact with the submarine's fast-moving silhouette. Inside the American boat, the captain issued calm but urgent instructions, guiding his crew through a series of micro-adjustments designed to maintain alignment with the destroyer's blind corridor, while staying just far enough ahead to avoid being overrun. The torpedo officer hunched over his targeting table, calculating lead angles that shifted constantly as the range collapsed and the relative speeds fluctuated with every surge of the sea. Sailors moved with precise coordination around him, adjusting valves, securing loose equipment, and preparing the forward tubes with a deliberate efficiency born from countless drills performed under calmer, more predictable conditions. The pressure inside the control room thickened as alarms flickered intermittently, warning of overheating components and ballast instability that could spiral out of control if the submarine encountered even a minor mechanical setback. Despite these warnings, the captain maintained a steady tone, reinforcing the notion that controlling the crew's anxiety was as crucial as controlling the vessel's heading, because hesitation or panic would undermine the delicate balance required to execute their impossible maneuver. His voice cut cleanly through the noise, guiding the men with a confidence that steadied their nerves even as the destroyer's thunderous engines grew louder with every passing moment. As the distance shrank below 200 yards, the submarine began to experience the full force of the destroyer's bow wave, causing the deck to cant sharply to port before slamming back into alignment with a jolt that echoed through every compartment. Water surged across the bow in thick sheets, hammering the hull and momentarily obscuring the view from the conning tower, prompting the lookout to crouch low and shield his eyes while shouting rapid updates through the open hatch. Inside, the sonar operator confirmed that the destroyer's acoustic profile had merged completely with the turbulence ahead of them, effectively erasing any chance that the enemy could track their exact position until it was too late to respond. The torpedo officer called out final bearing adjustments as the captain timed the moment for their decisive correction, knowing that the submarine needed to pivot at precisely the right instant to expose the broadside of the destroyer's forward quarter to the waiting torpedoes. Every man aboard understood that misjudging the angle by even a few degrees could result in a catastrophic collision, turning their bold tactic into a fatal mistake that would leave the boat crushed beneath thousands of tons of steel. Yet, despite the overwhelming pressure, the crew remained focused, trusting that the narrow window they had carved out through strategy and courage would hold long enough to deliver a crippling blow. In those final breaths before contact, the submarine surged forward with renewed determination, threading itself through the maelstrom created by the destroyer's advance, and the crew braced for the moment when their captain's daring gamble would either elevate them into legend or consign them to the deep. The moment the destroyer's bow rose on the crest of a towering swell, the captain recognized the fleeting opening he had been waiting for, a narrow window where the forward quarter of the enemy ship became exposed, just long enough for a torpedo to slip beneath its reinforced plating. He ordered a sharp starboard adjustment delivered with absolute conviction, and the helmsman executed the maneuver instantly, swinging the submarine into a precise angle that aligned the forward tubes with the vulnerable seam just beneath the destroyer's waterline. The boat lurched under the sudden correction, sending a deep metallic groan through the hull as equipment rattled violently and men braced against the sudden shift in momentum. In the torpedo room, the firing team responded with disciplined urgency, setting the gyros for an ultra-short-range shot that defied every piece of training they had ever received, because no manual envisioned launching torpedoes at a target so close that the wake from its bow almost washed across the submarine's deck. The torpedo officer shouted the final bearing, his voice rising above the rumble of the engines and the roar of the sea, while the crew steadied themselves for the recoil they knew would follow. When the captain gave the firing order, the release was instantaneous, sending a violent tremor through the submarine as compressed air hurled the first torpedo into the swirling blue chaos between the two vessels. For several agonizing seconds, the crew felt nothing except the rhythmic pounding of the destroyer's engines, reverberating through the water, leaving them suspended in a tense silence broken only by the hiss of ballast valves compensating for the sudden shift in weight. Then, beneath the cacophony of the storming sea, a sharp, unmistakable detonation rumbled through the depths, followed by a deeper resonance that told the captain the torpedo had struck exactly where he intended. The submarine shuddered as the blast wave rolled over the hull, but the captain remained steady, gripping the periscope housing while listening for the enemy's reaction with the intuition of a veteran hunter. On the destroyer, the impact erupted like a thunderclap beneath the forward engine compartments, sending a geyser of water and fractured plating high into the air as the bow lurched downward under the sudden loss of buoyancy. Crewmen were thrown off their feet by the explosion, sliding across the deck as alarms shrieked through the bridge and emergency lights flickered on in frantic bursts that illuminated the spreading panic. Sonar operators shouted conflicting reports, while engineers scrambled to seal flooding compartments, and the captain of the destroyer clung to the railing with white-knuckled disbelief, realizing that the submarine had executed a point-blank strike no tactical doctrine had ever considered possible. As the damaged destroyer veered off its course, struggling to maintain stability, the sea around it churned with debris and rising steam, forming a growing wound on the surface that confirmed the severity of the hit. The Japanese officers attempted to regroup, shouting orders to bring the secondary batteries to bear on the submarine, but the shock of the unexpected assault disrupted their coordination, leaving gunners firing sporadically into the mist without clear direction or confirmed targeting. Their carefully rehearsed engagement procedures unraveled under the weight of confusion because none of them had trained for a scenario where a submarine would willingly charge into the killing zone and strike with such devastating accuracy. Inside the American boat, the crew felt a surge of fierce, disciplined energy as the captain issued rapid follow-up commands, urging them to prepare for the next phase of the maneuver before the destroyer regained its footing. The men worked with urgent precision, aware that they had only seconds before the enemy stabilized enough to retaliate, yet they also sensed a shift in momentum that fueled their determination to press the advantage. Adrenaline coursed through the control room as the sound of groaning metal and rushing water from the crippled destroyer carried through the ocean, providing unmistakable proof that their impossible tactic had pierced the heart of a warship designed to hunt them. Despite the chaos unfolding around them, the captain remained composed, studying the listing destroyer through the periscope and calculating the optimal moment to reposition for another strike, knowing that seizing the initiative now would determine whether they survived the next minutes. The crew steadied themselves once more, recognizing that the first hit had not only damaged the enemy's ship, but shattered the enemy's certainty, creating the psychological breach they would need to turn one reckless gamble into the beginning of a legendary victory. The shockwave from the first detonation still rolled across the submarine's hull when the captain redirected his attention toward the destroyer's shifting silhouette, analyzing the precise moment when the enemy's propulsion faltered just enough to widen the acoustic blind corridor he intended to exploit. He understood that the explosion had created a turbulent cloud of debris, air bubbles, and pressure distortions that further degraded the destroyer's sonar performance, amplifying the natural weakness already present beneath its bow and extending the very zone that had allowed his boat to approach undetected. This expanding pocket of chaos acted like a temporary shield, masking the submarine's exact position while forcing the enemy to rely on visual tracking alone, a task made nearly impossible by the spray, smoke, and erratic motion generated by the damaged vessel. Inside the control room, the captain issued a sequence of deliberate commands designed to maximize the advantage created by the destroyed compartment, directing the helmsman to slip slightly to port before easing the engines into a carefully measured thrust that kept the submarine aligned with the turbulent wake. The maneuver required immense precision because drifting too far into clear water would expose them to sonar detection, while closing the distance too aggressively risked entering a collision path with a ship that no longer moved predictably. Each adjustment had to be measured by instinct as much as instrumentation, and the crew responded with a level of synchronized discipline that reflected their absolute trust in the captain's understanding of hydrodynamics under combat pressure. Meanwhile, the engineering team worked feverishly to stabilize the struggling machinery, compensating for fluctuations in ballast flow and battery output with quick calculations that prevented the boat from pitching uncontrollably during the high-stakes maneuver. Their efforts allowed the submarine to maintain a steady trim despite the sea's chaotic movement, ensuring the bow stayed angled correctly for any follow-up attack while minimizing noise that could betray their presence. The engineering officer shouted updates through the cramped compartment, informing the captain of each small victory over the failing systems, and these fragments of stability helped reinforce the crew's belief that they could hold their position inside the storm long enough to prepare the next strike. On the destroyer, the crew scrambled to regain control, shouting conflicting bearings as their instruments continued to fail under the overwhelming distortion created by flooding compartments, ruptured hull plating, and the massive plume of bubbles rising from the damaged bow. Sonar operators attempted to recalibrate their equipment, but the echoes returned as erratic bursts that dissolved into static before providing any useful information, leaving the officers blind to the submarine's maneuvering. Gun crews attempted to fire across the water, yet each shot fell wide as the ship listed unpredictably, making coordinated targeting nearly impossible while the sea heaved violently beneath their feet. The captain of the submarine recognized that this confusion created the perfect conditions for a follow-through attack, and he prepared to maneuver once more into the destroyer's vulnerable arc, timing his movement to the unpredictable rhythm of both vessels. He ordered the helmsman to ease the bow slightly upward while maintaining forward momentum, creating a stable firing platform that allowed the torpedo officer to refine the lead angle needed to strike a second critical compartment. The control room quieted into a focused intensity as the men awaited the next command, each understanding that success depended on capturing the destroyer at the exact moment its internal chaos peaked. Even as the submarine prepared to strike again, the captain could feel the shifting currents around the bow, recognizing that the violent mixture of air, debris, and pressure waves formed a hydrodynamic envelope that temporarily concealed their movement from both visual and acoustic detection. This natural camouflage, created by the enemy's own damage, allowed him to maneuver boldly without revealing a clear silhouette on the surface, buying precious seconds that transformed a dangerous gamble into a carefully sculpted opportunity. The crew remained steady through the turbulent motion, their hands gripping rails, consoles, and periscope housings as the submarine glided through the distorted water like a predator hidden within its prey's shadow. As the destroyer struggled to stabilize, alarms echoing across its deck and officers shouting for damage reports, the captain prepared to unleash the next torpedo, knowing that this strike would determine whether the enemy ship remained a threat or became another sinking silhouette in the vast Pacific. The submarine held its course with unwavering precision, moving deeper into the blind corridor that had saved them once already, and the crew braced themselves for the decisive moment when their impossible tactic would escalate from a daring survival maneuver into a full-fledged rout of the enemy's most trusted hunter. The captain watched the destroyer attempt to correct its listing bow, recognizing the frantic adjustments as the unmistakable signs of a ship fighting to reclaim balance before disaster compounded beyond recovery. He sensed that the enemy's engines were struggling to maintain coordinated thrust, their uneven vibrations radiating through the surrounding water like the labored breathing of a wounded animal desperately trying to reassert its dominance. With each passing second, the destroyer lost more structural integrity, producing a widening plume of turbulence that further masked the submarine's movement and provided the perfect backdrop for a second, even more devastating strike. Inside the control room, the torpedo officer synchronized the firing solution with meticulous care, compensating for the destroyer's unpredictable roll pattern while adjusting the gyro angle to target a compartment deeper within the hull. The crew moved around him with a quiet urgency, checking pressure gauges, verifying tube readiness, and ensuring that the submarine maintained the steady posture required for a clean launch despite the roiling sea outside. Every man understood that this shot, if delivered with precision, would push the enemy vessel beyond the point of salvage, crippling its internal systems and forcing the Japanese squadron to reassess the threat they believed they had cornered. On the destroyer's bridge, officers barked hasty commands to redirect fire toward suspected contact points, but their orders dissolved amid conflicting reports from damaged instruments and terrified lookouts who struggled to see anything through the dense spray and rising smoke. The ship's gunners attempted to pivot their mounts, yet the constant listing and surging motion made even basic tracking nearly impossible, causing shells to burst harmlessly across empty water where the submarine had been moments earlier. One officer gripped the railing with trembling hands, staring into the froth-churned surface while praying for a glimpse of their elusive adversary. Yet all he saw were shattered planks and rising bubbles, marking the site of the first impact. The submarine, hidden within the chaotic wake, drifted into its final firing position with a deceptive serenity that belied the violence it was preparing to unleash, and the captain's voice echoed through the compartment with calm precision as he authorized the second launch. The torpedo surged from the tube with a dull thud, vanishing into the turbulent water before anyone on the enemy ship could recognize the threat moving silently beneath them. For a few long seconds, the ocean seemed to hold its breath as both vessels continued their intertwined dance, one struggling for survival and the other gliding forward with predatory intent. The detonation erupted beneath the destroyer's midsection with catastrophic force, sending a violent shockwave through the ship that buckled internal bulkheads and tore open entire compartments in a single devastating moment. Steel plates twisted apart as geysers of water erupted through the ruptured hull, flinging debris across the deck, while crewmen were hurled off their feet and thrown against railings or violently slammed into equipment. Fires broke out almost instantly near the forward boiler rooms, fed by ruptured fuel lines and spreading rapidly as the ship's damage control teams attempted to respond despite the chaos erupting around them. The destroyer's engines began to fail in rapid succession, producing a grinding mechanical scream that reverberated across the water as the vessel lost all remaining thrust and drifted helplessly into the swell. Officers shouted orders for counter-flooding and emergency seals, but the ship was taking on water faster than the pumps could compensate, causing the bow to dip even lower while smoke billowed from the shattered superstructure. Panic rippled across the deck as sailors realized the extent of the damage, and many stared in disbelief toward the sea, unable to comprehend how a single submarine had managed to cripple a warship designed specifically to hunt and destroy it. Inside the American submarine, the crew remained steady despite the echoes of the explosion reverberating through the hull, knowing that their bold tactic had succeeded beyond expectation and delivered a crippling blow that would change the course of the engagement. The captain allowed himself a single controlled breath before ordering the crew to prepare for evasive maneuvering, understanding that even a dying destroyer could still pose a threat if its remaining guns were brought to bear in desperation. His men acknowledged the command with renewed determination, sensing that they had crossed the threshold between survival and dominance, transforming their desperate gamble into a tactical masterpiece that shattered the enemy's confidence and opened the door to the coming rout. As the destroyer continued to list and burn, its crew overwhelmed by shock and disbelief, the submarine slipped deeper into the chaotic waters beneath the plume of smoke, moving with calculated purpose while preparing to confront the next target in the Japanese formation. The wrecked destroyer had barely begun to slip beneath the waves when the captain redirected his focus toward the broader formation, recognizing that the chaos spreading through the Japanese line created an opening far larger than any single victory. The second explosion had thrown the squadron into disarray, fracturing their once coordinated search pattern and forcing each ship to respond independently rather than as part of the cohesive hunting pack they had been trained to operate within. This breakdown in structure granted the submarine a rare advantage, allowing it to maneuver freely within the disrupted formation, while the enemy wasted precious minutes trying to regain situational awareness through failing instruments and panicked visual reports. As the submarine eased into deeper water, the control room hummed with a tense but controlled energy, fueled by the knowledge that the captain intended to press forward rather than retreat now that the balance of power had shifted. The torpedo officer worked rapidly to reset firing solutions based on the new positions of the remaining ships, adjusting calculations to account for their erratic movements as they attempted to avoid collisions and reposition for counterattacks. They no longer had the clarity to execute effectively. Crewmen refreshed the tubes with disciplined efficiency, sliding new torpedoes into place while keeping the noise level as low as possible to maintain the element of confusion that continued to cloud the enemy's perception. Several hundred yards to the north, A second destroyer accelerated to flank speed in a desperate attempt to encircle the submarine, its engines roaring as it swung into a wide arc that churned the surface into streaks of white foam. However, the ship's haste caused it to enter the very turbulence created by the sinking vessel, blinding its sonar and masking the submarine's presence long enough for the captain to angle the bow toward its vulnerable stern quarter. He issued a crisp bearing order that set the torpedo tubes into alignment once more, and the firing sequence followed with seamless coordination, sending another pair of deadly shapes streaming silently through the water toward their target. Moments later, a sharp double blast tore through the sea as the torpedoes struck the destroyer's aft compartments, ripping through propeller shafts and severing power conduits that sent the ship spinning helplessly into a tightening spiral before its engines finally died. Fires erupted across the stern as crewmen scrambled to abandon ship, their frantic shouts rising above the roar of escaping steam and collapsing metal. The captain observed the unfolding destruction through the periscope, noting how the ship's listing hull blocked the nearest escort vessel's line of sight, creating yet another shield of confusion that he could exploit to maneuver deeper into the heart of the formation. The submarine pressed forward with deliberate stealth, using the smoke plumes and boiling water as cover while it stalked a large transport vessel attempting to break away from the battle. The merchant ship carried no significant armament, but its bulky silhouette made it a strategically valuable target, because destroying it would further disrupt the Japanese supply chain and worsen the psychological blow dealt by the earlier strikes. The captain approached from beneath the dispersing layer of bubbles left by the crippled destroyers, maintaining a shallow depth that kept his periscope just high enough to track the vessel's course without exposing the boat to retaliatory fire from the remaining escorts. When the submarine closed the distance, the captain authorized a single torpedo release aimed directly at the transport's midsection, trusting that its massive profile would ensure an unmistakable hit even under shifting wave conditions. The crew held their breath as the weapon disappeared into the dark water, and within moments a towering column of spray erupted alongside the transport, splitting its hull and igniting a cascade of internal failures that caused the ship to settle rapidly by the bow. Panic swept across the remaining vessels as they watched another ship fall victim to an enemy they could neither locate nor predict, fueling an atmosphere of dread that undermined the discipline they had once relied upon. Inside the submarine, the captain used this mounting fear to his advantage, weaving the boat through the expanding pockets of confusion, while identifying new targets that had drifted out of formation in their attempts to escape the unseen predator. His strategy was no longer about survival alone. It had evolved into a methodical dismantling of the entire convoy, leveraging tactical insight, environmental distortion, and enemy panic to create a cascading chain of vulnerabilities. The crew followed his lead with unwavering focus, realizing that the chaos enveloping the Japanese squadron was the very engine driving their unprecedented string of victories, transforming what began as a desperate gamble into the opening chapter of a legendary offensive that would culminate in the destruction of 19 ships across the span of a single relentless patrol. The rapid destruction of the transport vessel sent a shock wave of disbelief through the surviving Japanese ships, creating a sudden silence on their bridges, as officers struggled to comprehend how a single submarine had dismantled a formation designed to entrap and annihilate underwater threats. Their confidence, once anchored in the ironclad belief that superior sonar discipline and aggressive maneuvering made them untouchable, now faltered under the mounting evidence that their most fundamental assumptions no longer applied. Each explosion felt less like an isolated strike and more like the unraveling of an entire tactical doctrine, leaving commanders grasping for explanations that their training had never prepared them to consider. As the smoke from the sinking ships drifted across the water, the squadron's remaining destroyer attempted to reassert command authority by issuing rapid signals to reorganize their spacing, but the fragmented formation responded sluggishly because fear had already seeped into every decision. Sailors who once moved with machine-like precision now hesitated before confirming bearings, uncertain whether the dark shapes beneath the waves represented debris, bubbles, or the lethal approach of an unseen adversary. The chain of command, normally reinforced by strict naval discipline, weakened under the weight of conflicting reports, leaving senior officers unsure whether to pursue, retreat, or hold position in hopes of regaining a clear picture of the battlefield.